and Betsy Stern Conference Center at Hudson Institute for today's book forum on the publication of former Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld's Known and Unknown, a memoir. I'm Ken Weinstein, President and CEO of Hudson Institute, and I'm delighted you could be with us here today. And I'd also like to welcome our viewers on C-SPAN's Book TV, as well as our distinguished panel of experts. Secretary Rumsfeld is well known around these parts. He's been a friend of Hudson Institute for more than 4 decades. He knew our founder, the great futurist and strategist Herman Kahn, quite well, and has been the recipient of our James H. Doolittle Award for extraordinary contributions to American national security. It is an honor to welcome you back to Hudson, sir. This year, Hudson Institute celebrates a half-century of forward-looking analytic policy research. Herman Kahn, Max Singer, and Oscar Rubhausen founded Hudson Institute in 1961 because they saw the need for a more publicly engaged think tank. They envisioned a public policy organization that would think creatively about how to achieve a better future while avoiding what they termed unthinkable threats, and they would draw on the creativity of scholars to help shape public debate on the critical issues of the day. Our research has stood the test of time in a world dramatically transformed by the collapse of the Soviet Union, the rise of China, and the advent of radicalism within Islam. The core of our work is independent policy research, our willingness to examine critical and complex issues from different perspectives. To better understand the future, which is our mission, it is essential to get a better understanding of the past, especially the recent past. Even though we know that the past will never be perfectly understood, and the questions raised by the study of the past will never be totally settled. We're proud of Hudson's first half-century of forging ideas that promote security, prosperity, and freedom, and we look forward to Hudson's next 50 years. During this anniversary year, we're hosting an extensive program of seminars and celebrations. Today's event is one of these, and we're delighted that you could be a part of these events. Today, our discussion examines some of the major decisions related to the U.S. reaction to the 9/11 terror attacks, and does so through the lens of former Secretary Rumsfeld's remarkable account of these events. Secretary Rumsfeld's book, Known and Unknown, is a New York Times bestseller and is available at the end of the event for sale at the reduced price of $20. Forgive us, Mr. Secretary. But I urge, it is a absolutely gripping and fascinating read, and I urge all of you to purchase the book, whether you're here or you do so online. And now it is my distinct pleasure to turn the event over to Hudson Senior Fellow Douglas Feith, the former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, himself the author of a critically acclaimed memoir, War and Decision, that is also available in the back, that for $10, but this is a paperback. And Doug has the honor of animating today's discussion. Doug?
Thank you, Ken. I would also like to welcome all of you here, and in particular welcome my fellow panelists. To my left is General Peter Pace, a Marine, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He retired in 2007, and before becoming chairman, he served for 4 years as vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs. He's now a businessman and continues to advise the Defense Department as a member of the Defense Policy Board, and is active in charitable work on behalf of America's wounded warriors. And then to his left is Jamie McIntyre, who was for 16 years until 2008 CNN's senior Pentagon correspondent. He was in the building on September 11th, 2001, and he's now a news consultant, a blogger, and teaches at the University of Maryland. To his left is Scooter Libby, who was my colleague here at the Hudson Institute, where he serves as senior vice president. He worked as chief of staff for Vice President Dick Cheney and was a regular attendee at the that are the subject of so much of Mr. Rumsfeld's book. Mr. Rumsfeld is quite literally the person who needs no introduction, so I will not give him one. If you want to know about his extensive background in government, there's no better way to do it than to read his book, and I would urge everybody to do that.
The full price book, preferably.
And by the way, I'd like to make the observation that Secretary Rumsfeld is donating all of his revenues from the book to charity. After the panelists offer some opening thoughts for a few minutes each, I'll ask Secretary Rumsfeld to respond and get a conversation going among us here on the podium, and then we'll take questions from our audience. If you want to pose a question, we've left cards on everybody's chair. Please write your question down and pass it forward, and we'll get to as many of the questions as we can. Now, I'd like to get the panel discussion going with a few comments. First, regarding the substance and tone of the book, Secretary Rumsfeld has written an important book. It's full of revealing stories and historically significant information. It's been selling impressively, as Ken Weinstein pointed out. It's been on the bestseller list of the New York Times since it came out something like 7 weeks ago. The book contradicts a number of popular misconceptions about the war on terrorism, the Iraq War, and other subjects. It deals with a number of matters that were very hot controversies. State Department versus Defense Department disputes over Afghanistan and CENTCOM's partnership with the Afghan Northern Alliance, the strategy in Tora Bora, the rationale for the light footprint approach, the failures of the multilateral approach in building up Afghanistan after the overthrow of the Taliban, disagreements about when and how to use NATO. Regarding Iraq, it explains how decisions were made to go to war, how U.S. troop levels were set, how policy officials used intelligence regarding Iraqi weapons of mass destruction, how planning was done for the post-Saddam period, how key elements of that planning were undone in the field. The book devotes quite a bit of attention to detainee matters and reveals how Secretary Rumsfeld was reluctant for the Pentagon to take on the detainee mission, how he twice offered to resign over the Abu Ghraib scandal, and that he now regrets that he did not insist on President Bush's accepting his resignation. I'd like to say a quick word about the criticism that some commentators have made that the book is full of blame shifting and finger pointing. I don't think that a fair-minded reader would characterize the book that way. Its tone is analytical. It's not harsh or recriminatory. Some critics have attributed to Mr. Rumsfeld virtually every problem that arose in the national security field during the Bush administration. Now he gets condemned for blame shifting when he points out that some of the original accusations were ungrounded. And it just shows that in politics, critics can get you coming and going. Now, a second matter, Secretary Rumsfeld's relations with his generals. The book shows that there were times when the secretary challenged and contradicted his generals, and there were times when he deferred to them. When a secretary presses his generals and questions their work, as Mr. Rumsfeld did when he reviewed version after version of General Franks's war plans for Afghanistan and Iraq, he leaves himself vulnerable to the charge that he is micromanaging and interfering in professional military judgments. But when a secretary defers to his generals in the field, as Mr. Rumsfeld did for years during the Iraq War, before the surge when the war wasn't going well, he leaves himself vulnerable to the charge that he's failing in his chain of command responsibilities. I'd like to ask Secretary Rumsfeld to elaborate on how he decided when to challenge and when to defer.
Do I answer now?
In time.
Oh. Well, the short answer is imperfectly.
Third, the role of a cabinet official. Just as there are issues when a Secretary of Defense should challenge or defer to his generals, there are important questions that the book raises about when a cabinet officer should challenge or defer to a president. And it's clear that Mr. Rumsfeld viewed the duties of a cabinet official differently from the way Colin Powell did. And I'd like to ask you, Mr. Secretary, to elaborate on this and how you see the role of a cabinet official in dealing with difficult and controversial issues when he thinks the president may be ill-informed or wrong in his judgment. Fourth and last, I'd like to ask Secretary Rumsfeld to comment on current affairs. There's too much happening in the world to avoid at least one look at current affairs. Drawing on his experiences as Secretary of Defense, President Obama has launched a U.S.-led military action in Libya. He preempted what he feared was going to be a major humanitarian disaster there. And you, Secretary Rumsfeld, helped develop various ideas and principles for U.S. military action after 9/11 regarding U.S. leadership, coalition building, definition of the military mission, U.S. freedom of action, role of UN, etc. I'd like you to comment on how you think President Obama is handling Libya. Is he respecting or violating the principles that you helped develop for the Bush administration? And I hope that's sufficiently provocative for starters. And now I'd like to ask General Pace to give a few of his comments about the matters dealt with in the Secretary's book.
Doug, thanks very much. It's a great pleasure to be here with you today. First of all, because I have great respect for the folks on this platform with me, number one. And number two, it is absolutely true that in many, many quiet ways, Secretary Rumsfeld has continued to support the troops and their families, and the proceeds from this book is just another example and why I'm proud to be sitting here next to him on this occasion. I won't speak to the book precisely. I'd like to just share with you some thoughts about things that, had I known at the time, I would have made different recommendations, because I think if we're going to move forward and learn from our mistakes, we need to understand what those mistakes were. In Afghanistan, for example, when the war first began in Afghanistan, we needed about 20,000 reservists. And after the attacks on 9/11, we had literally hundreds of thousands of reservists who were volunteering to serve the country. So rather than call up reserve units, we elected to take volunteers. And that made absolute sense at the time. We didn't have Iraq in our heads. We had Afghanistan in our heads. We had a number of about 20,000, and we had hundreds of thousands who were volunteering. In retrospect, that recommendation to take volunteers was not a good one. The reason being that when we went into Iraq, we then needed significantly more reservists. And out of fairness, we determined that those who had served already would not serve a second tour until everyone had served a first tour. Again, makes good sense. But the result of that was that a unit that was to be deployed might have had 20-30% of its folks already deployed. So they stayed home, and we had to go to other units to fill in those spaces. Over time, 2 units replacing 1 became 4 units replacing 1, became 8 units replacing 1. And it all goes back to the original premise that we would take volunteer reservists in Afghanistan, and I was certainly one of the voices that was supportive of that. In retrospect, not a good idea. Next, in Afghanistan, there was a great deal of discussion amongst the U.S., the Afghan government, and our NATO allies as to the size of coalition allies at the time, not NATO at the time, coalition allies at the time, about what was the proper size for the Afghan army. And as I recall, General Wardock, who was the Minister of Defense, was asking us to help him build an army of about 400,000. Collectively, all the coalition looked at that and said, in a country with an economy that was $6 billion, GDP of $6 billion, $2 billion of which was drug money, did it make sense to strap them with the responsibility of a 400,000-man army that they could not afford? So collectively, and I certainly agreed, the number that was determined was about 70,000 was a good number for them to have as an army they could afford to maintain going forward. Well, fast forward to the problems that led to the request for more U.S. troops. And the math is fairly simple. To have 10,000 U.S. troops on active duty, it cost taxpayers about $1 billion a year. To send 30,000 troops as a surge to Afghanistan, you have to have about $3 billion worth of troops in your inventory. To replace them every other year, you need to have $6 billion worth of troops in your inventory. To replace them 1 year over and 2 years back, which is a preferred, you need $9 billion worth of troops in your inventory, and that's before you start to use them, which is going to cost you X billion dollars a month. It was probably around 2006, I don't have my exact timeline in my head, when it became obvious that we were going to need more troops. That the math no longer made sense. And we went to the Secretary, and to my knowledge he went to the President, and recommended that we in fact change and increase the size of the Afghan army. Because in the long run, if it cost us, and I'll make these numbers up, $2 billion a year to supplement the Afghan government so they could have 400,000 troops on their rolls, at the end of the day we would have the right country's troops doing work inside of Afghanistan, and the cost to the U.S. taxpayer, for sure, would be a whole lot less. But at the time, going back to the situation on the ground and the understanding of the Afghan government's ability to fund their own military, 70,000 troops seemed to make sense, even though 400,000 makes a whole lot more sense now. Next. Some folks wonder, why is it that when we did do the surge in Afghanistan, why we should expect a different outcome than we had had since October of 2001? And to understand that, you need to go back to around March of 2003 when we went into Iraq. At the time, there was very little activity in Afghanistan, some, but not a lot. And the military assessment was, and I was part of it, that we could go into Iraq, but if we needed more troops someplace else in the world, we would not be able to do the rotation of forces that we wanted to do. It was certainly discussed amongst all the leadership, but at the time it appeared that we could go into Iraq, do what we needed to do there, and still have a rotation of forces. As Afghanistan started to bubble again, and while Iraq was more difficult than we thought it would be, we ended up with a basic decision of either leaving the troops who were in place there for as long as it took, or maintaining our all-volunteer force and having rotation of forces. When the decision was made to maintain rotation of forces, then we were in what in military terms is called an economy of force mission in Afghanistan. Think of Germany and Japan in World War II. Germany was a primary theater. Japan was the economy of force theater until we won in Europe so we could switch resources, shift resources to the Pacific. That's what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan. We gave enough troops and maintained enough troops in Iraq until we were able to shift forces over to Afghanistan. So it wasn't until 2008 that we were able to start plussing up the numbers of troops that we needed in Afghanistan based on the threat that was there. So there is a reason to believe and have expectations that from 2008 forward that you could have different experience on the ground in Afghanistan than we had before, because we were able to allocate the right amount of resources to that theater. In Iraq, going into Iraq, I believed the intelligence as did everyone I know, that when we crossed the line of departure out of Kuwait into Iraq, that whole divisions, 14 to 16,000 troops of Iraqi soldiers, would surrender and become part of the liberation force. Makes sense to a Western mind, makes sense to somebody who's lived in freedom all of his life, makes sense that we liberators would be welcomed with open arms and flag waving, and that of course the Army would be loyal to their new government. Turns out that they did not surrender en masse, nor did they fight. They disintegrated. They went home, which leads to another assumption that proved to be false. In military planning, an assumption is something that if it is wrong, your plan fails. There's been a lot of discussion about phase 4 in Iraq, and a discussion that there was no planning about phase 4. Phase 4 being, what do you do after you win? How do you maintain security? It's not that we didn't plan phase 4. But one of the basic assumptions for phase 4 was that not only would there be the U.S. troops on the ground and our coalition partners, but that fundamentally the 400,000-man Iraqi army would be intact, loyal to the new government. They weren't. They had disintegrated. They went home. So the brilliant strategic surprise that Tommy Franks accomplished by not putting 500,000 troops on the perimeter, not bombing for 45 days, but rather going with 150,000 and bombing at the same time, getting him to Baghdad in 3 weeks. That brilliant tactical/strategic opportunity on the ground was then followed by a string of troops who were on call but not in country, and a lack of Iraqi security forces to provide security in more places than we could. Lastly, with regard to WMD, I don't know anybody at the senior level, certainly in the U.S. military, who did not believe, as I did, that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, at least chemical weapons, which he had already used on his own people and on his neighbors in Iran. We believed it so firmly that we ensured that our troops were well trained and properly equipped before we put them into combat. And we fully expected that there was a line someplace short of Baghdad where when we crossed it, Saddam would hit us with chemicals. That assumption was wrong. I was relieved that he did not attack our troops with chemical weapons. Like everybody else, over time, I was chagrined that we found no weapons of mass destruction. But each of these cases, and I've thought about this a lot, and it may or may not give you comfort, but the good news and the bad news is the same news, which is that if you gave me the exact same intelligence, you gave me the exact same data in each one of these cases, I'd give you the exact same recommendation. And these were not knee-jerk reactions. These were the results of Tommy Franks coming to D.C. and briefing 30, 40, 50 times with the Secretary of the DepSecDef, Dick Myers, who was chairman, me as vice chairman, going to the White House many, many times. These decisions were made at the very careful, deliberate discussion, dialogue, pushing back and forth. We need to acknowledge where we were wrong, but we also have to remember it in historical context as what we knew at the time. And without pointing fingers at each other, ensure that whatever it was that caused us to have the wrong intelligence, whatever it was that caused us to have the wrong analysis, that we understand that part and learn that lesson and teach it in our schools so the youngsters who are coming up now who will be the next chairman, the next vice chairman, have a better context or a broader context in which to make their own analysis. Thanks.
Thank you, Jamie.
Okay. Thank you. I'm Jamie McIntyre, and any of you have kids or watch Sesame Street, you know that song, one of these things is not like the other. I'm feeling like a little bit like the odd man out here. I didn't actually serve in the Bush administration, although I'm sure some of my critics, when I was covering the Pentagon, might have accused me of that. The other day I was reading, maybe you saw this comic on Sunday, Doonesbury. Gary Trudeau always has this great ability to capture the zeitgeist of what's going on in the culture. And he did a piece on Facebook in which the character in the comic strip is reflecting on her Facebook page and realizing it's gotten completely out of hand. And she refers to it as an over-curated version of my life in which I'm accomplished, happy, and attractive, and even my faults are endearing. And when I read that, I thought, yeah, that is Facebook. And then I thought, and then there's Rumsfeld's book. Actually, because even his faults are endearing in this book. Actually, I really love this book because as a journalist, I'm really big on sort of trying to understand, what's going on. One of the things when you're a journalism has famously been called a first rough draft of history. And it's invariably wrong and incomplete. And as you're there trying to construct that part of history, you're always wishing you knew what you don't have access to. And you have this illusion that if you could simply get behind the closed doors into those meetings, if you could hear the secretary, if you could witness this stuff firsthand that these guys get to see all the time, that then you'd have clarity. And then you read a book like Secretary Rumsfeld's and you realize, no, actually, if you were there, you still wouldn't know what was going on. It's just not always that clear at the time. And one of the things that the news media doesn't do very well is it doesn't do nuance. We just don't do nuance well. And and that's actually reflected in the title of the book, Known and Unknown, because Secretary Rumsfeld explained that concept to us at the Pentagon briefing one day, and to me it made perfect sense. In fact, it not only makes sense, it's sort of self-evident. The idea that there are things that we know and things we don't know and things we don't know. And he explains in the first part of the book sort of the origin of that. And then I was really flabbergasted to notice that over time, various reporters and commentators would portray that as some sort of, some misstatement or malapropism or something and I'm thinking, well, don't they get it? This is a very straightforward recitation of the problem that you face making decisions when you have incomplete information. So I really applaud the effort of the book, and I have to say it's very impressive, the documentation, even though it does seem to have and I'm going to go out on a limb here and say it has sort of a pro-Rumsfeld slant. We can debate that later.
Why don't you just give him the hook?
It's very, it's very impressive. But the other thing I want to say is I also commend it because I feel like Donald Rumsfeld is the anti-Dan Snyder, and Dan Snyder is the very wealthy and powerful leader, owner of the Washington Redskins, and he felt that he was being portrayed unfairly and unfavorably in the press, and his response was to file a lawsuit against a very small publication, and which in my opinion, was sort of ill-advised and somewhat unbecoming. And I think Secretary Rumsfeld has taken the exact opposite approach in that he has marshaled his facts together, put together all the documentation, laid out his case in a very cogent fashion. And while we can and maybe we will argue about parts of it today, it's a very impressive work, and I think it really adds to our understanding. It certainly adds to my understanding of what happened during the time when I was there and I was trying to figure it out. Anyway.
Thank you. Let me just say, anybody who has a question that he wants to write down on the card, you can raise it, and our colleague Ioannis, whose hand is up in the back, he will see you raising a card and come and retrieve it from you and pass it forward. Scooter, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Doug. It's nice to be here. I particularly enjoy the opportunity to watch your staff throw questions at you, sir. It seems that a rare opportunity. I think Doug showed a little bit too much enthusiasm myself. But,
There's a tomorrow.
there's a tomorrow. And it's an unexpected pleasure to be here with this Bush 43 Pentagon crowd and their groupie.
I'll get you for that.
I say unexpected pleasure because the person who should be here is my former boss, Vice President Cheney. As many of you here may know, Secretary Rumsfeld gave Vice President Cheney his first job in the government, his first opportunity, and it was an extraordinary pleasure to watch two of these brilliant men working together with each other in difficult times. They remain friends to this day, but that's not to say there wasn't a little bit of rivalry between them every now and then. So when I was visiting with Vice President Cheney not long ago, I happened to mention to him, you may know that Vice President Cheney is working on his own book at this point. So I happened to mention to him, Don's book is still on the bestseller list. It's 815 pages. Well, he got right back to work right after that. So. Yep.
A lot of that 815 is the index.
Pete was talking about some intelligence issues, and there was covered in known and unknown. There was a passage about the morning intelligence briefing. I should say that Vice President Cheney also took these morning intelligence briefings, except he took them actually twice each morning. I believe, sir, you only took your intelligence briefing once. Is that correct? Yes. So he would take it once, the Vice President would take the intelligence briefing once with the President at 7 a.m. But he would also take it at 6 a.m. before he met with the President so that he would be well familiar with the content of the meetings, of what was in the briefing before he sat down with the President. Now, I would usually go over to his house before the 6 a.m. briefing, and this all worked fine, except the Vice President did it even when he was out of town. So when he was in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, for example, as you might guess, which is 2 hours behind, the President's briefing was at 5 a.m. and the Vice President's briefing was at 4 a.m. And I would have to get over to his house before 4 a.m. Now, again, that's not so bad under normal circumstances, but I don't know how many of you have been in Wyoming in winter, but it tended to be minus 40 degrees, windy, snowy, and one particular year we had, I think, 8 feet of snow in 10 days. So I would grab my 15-pound briefcase, and since the roads weren't plowed at 3 a.m. with 8 feet of snow, and there was a golf course in between where I was and where he was, I would march out across the golf course, wading through this bottomless snow, trying to get over to his house. And one of these mornings, I've got my briefcase, I've got the minus 40 degrees, it's 3 a.m. on a dark golf course, as I'm headed out to see my boss, and as I'm just about to clear the last set of trees at the edge of this golf course, about 20 yards from his back door, I suddenly realized that the terror threat is at orange. We've been receiving intelligence about threats to White House personnel, and the Secret Service may not think it's so amusing that this guy is coming through the woods behind his house, sort of within hand grenade distance. Now, we all had badges, to alert the Secret Service not to shoot us. But it was dark. I had 3 layers of clothing over my badge. And also, there was no light. It was perfectly pitch black. I had no flashlight with me. As they say, you go to work with the staff that you have.
Good point.
So there I am, my 15-pound briefcase, which probably in the dark looked like a satchel charge to the Secret Service. I'm completely hooded. My parka happens to be black. There are no lights, and I'm 20 yards from the Vice President's house. And I realized 2 things. First, the Secret Service guys are really good shots. Second, the shots will likely wake the neighbors. So I'll be dead and a failure. Now, I don't mind being dead. It's wartime. But I don't ever want it said that I didn't do good staff work. So I decide that the only thing to do, wading through the snow with my hooded black parka and my 15-pound satchel, is to sing. Loud enough so I don't startle the Secret Service, but not so loud that I wake the neighbors. The problem is, what do I sing? The only thing that comes to mind is an obscene song by the rapper Eminem. Now, I don't know how many of you know what Mrs. Cheney thinks of Eminem. So, I finally come up to the Secret Service agent. And it happens by bad luck to be a friend of mine, and who I'd taken a few nights before drinking too many shots of tequila at the Cowboy Bar, which you may know. And I said to him, I tried to pull my dignity together, and I said to him, "Why didn't you shoot me?" Seemed like part of his job. And he said, "You know, do you think a terrorist is stupid enough to be out here on a night like this?" So I finally make it into the vice president's house. I'm covered in snow. I'm freezing from minus 40 degrees. I'm hoarse from trying to sing over a howling storm. I'm drenched in sweat. My briefcase is soaked. There's an icicle hanging from my face. My hands are shaking because I almost got shot, and the vice president walks by. And he takes a look at me, and he can see that my job satisfaction is suboptimal. And he says, "You don't know what it was like working for Rumsfeld."
I don't believe it.
Well, sir, there's not a truer story in that book. There are several interesting sub-themes in Known and Unknown, and I was going to prepare to raise several of them, but I don't think there's time for maybe more than one and a third, but let me take a crack at that. One of the themes, or sub-themes, is the importance of strategic thinking. The book describes Ronald Reagan as, quote, strong, long-range, with strategic sense, so essential to successful leadership. The book describes President Nixon as a strategic thinker, often looking 2 to 3 steps ahead in a crisis. By contrast, the book describes as a dangerous misjudgment the, quote, post-Cold War holiday from strategic thought that characterized much of the 1990s. And the book contrasts this notably with the strategic thinking of one of our main competitors, a rising China. The book says, and I'll quote, "Unlike many Western policymakers, the Chinese make a practice of thinking several moves ahead while they look to take advantage of current events." The book notes that the Chinese to this day live by the writings of a 5th century BC writer, Sun Tzu, who was a long-range strategic thinker. And it quotes from him. It says, quote, "Be extremely mysterious," Sun Tzu writes, "even to the point of soundlessness." Now, by the way, Mr. Secretary, when it comes to being extremely mysterious, do you really think the Chinese have a lot to teach, Vice President Cheney? As part of the kind of strategic thinking we need, the book points to the importance of avoiding mirror imaging. That is, we need to think through how our enemies see a problem, not how we see it. And for that, intelligence plays the most important role. As Pete highlighted, a related problem, a related theme in the book is the problem with intelligence. As another strategic element of strategic thinking, the book notes that surprise is inevitable. There's a fabulous quote from September 10th, if I recall, of 2001, from the Vice President. And it says that we need to consider our vulnerabilities with imagination. It quotes it quotes Frederick the Great, who asked his generals, quote, "What designs would I be forming if I were the enemy?" Close quote. Of course, I should point out that that is mirror imaging, Mr. Secretary. And frankly, I was a little disappointed in letting Frederick the Great say that. Then I realized that was before he worked for you. I think, as you would say, the question Frederick the Great should have asked is, who has studied how this enemy thinks? And ask that man what the enemy might plan. Next, as the book notes, we tend to treat the unfamiliar as the improbable. The results can ruin your day. There's a passage that I like very much. Quote, "The period covered by this book was one of great obscurity to those who lived through it. Not only was the future clouded, a common enough situation, but the present was equally clouded. We groped after interpretations of events, sometimes reversed lines of action based on earlier views, and hesitated long before grasping what now seems obvious. We had more than the usual difficulty discerning the shape of events." That's not Don Rumsfeld in 2011. It's Dean Acheson writing about the 1940s, a period that people today think was much less complex, and a period when we had a theory of containment, a strategy of containment, which in fact leading figures of the time had wildly different interpretations. As you emphasize the importance of clear strategic thinking, I should also quote this passage to be judged by your readers. Quote, "Terrorism is a form of warfare and must be treated as such. Simply standing in a defensive position, absorbing blows, is not enough. Terrorism must be deterred." Close quote. That's not Don Rumsfeld in 2011. That's Don Rumsfeld in 1984. Orwell's fictional vision of internal terror in 1984 was inspired by a real-world threat. So was Rumsfeld's version in 1984. In October 1977, Time magazine cover was titled "The War on Terrorism." In 1979, a Time cover was entitled "Islam, the Militant Revival." In your book, you note the importance of precision in thought and terminology to achieve sound strategic thinking. You note your view that we should define the enemy in our current travails as, quote, Islamist. That position remains controversial, and I hope you'll have a chance to discuss it. So one theme is the importance of clear strategic thinking and the difficulty that has posed for America. A second related theme touches on the all too common imperfections of our interagency process. Processes not incidentally, but should be important for forming strategy. You cite interdepartmental squabbles between the NSC, state, and defense as being common in your period, but that includes from the Nixon administration to the present. You note both interagency and interdepartmental problems. Mr. Secretary, your observations in this realm are, as you note, sadly, not new. You could well have cited sources even before your era. Preeminent Cold War historian, Yale's John Lewis Gaddis, said of the Kennedy administration, "Kennedy's strategy broke down because it did nothing to prevent the subordination of strategic interests to those of the organizations implementing the strategy. Large bureaucracies all too often develop their own institutional momentum, making them impervious either to instructions from above or to feedback from below." Legendary scholar Samuel Huntington, writing of the Eisenhower years, said, "We ought not to be surprised that organizations resist innovation. They are supposed to resist." In that same era, Dean Acheson, writing more of the Truman period, quotes Townsend Hoops, the historian. "Our difficulty is that as a nation of short-term pragmatists, accustomed to dealing with the future only when it becomes the present, we find it hard to regard future trends as serious realities. Yet failure to achieve this new habit of mind is likely to prove fatal." Henry Kissinger, writing as an historian as well as a participant, wrote, "Most foreign policies that history has marked highly in whatever country have been originated by leaders who were opposed by the experts. I hope you have a chance to comment, Mr. Secretary, on inter- and intra-departmental problems in the context of a fluid world. There lie my 1.33 themes that I said that I would manage. I have too little time to go on. Time is short, the star awaits. And I want to congratulate you, Mr. Secretary, on your memoir and on writing a history of the Bush administration that I think in years to come many will see as the second best book on the topic.
Well, now, my goodness gracious, I look out there and I see people who were in the administration, many of whom could give the answers to the questions that these folks have posed every bit as well as I. Ken, thank you for your hospitality. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to be here with this group of panelists, and I now go to work with the panel I have, such as it is. I'm told I have, 10 or 12 minutes or something to comment, and then...
20 if you want them.
And I was told not to interrupt, but you all are allowed to? Is that the way it works? The process of the book, I debated really whether I should take a year and write a book basically from memory. But I had such a rich archive, having lived a third of our country's history, that I decided to take 4 years, digitize a lot of my papers, and create a website that now has over 3,500 documents on it. Must be 10 or 20 thousand pages of paper that have been put there, so that when someone reads the book, they're able to see a paragraph I've quoted from a primary source document often, and go to the endnote, and then go straight to the website and read the entire memo, and not just the memo, the one paragraph that I put there, so that we'll, rather than rewriting history, we want to write history and try to correct what Jamie calls the first draft of history in a way that will be helpful to serious people who are interested in learning and reading the original documents from the website, and the approach of people who were actually there, as opposed to people who were talking to people who were there, probably mostly 2 or 3 layers down. So I took 4 years and have been enjoying completing it and having a chance to answer questions about it. The questions that Doug had, it seems to me, are interesting ones. One involved the deferring to generals or not deferring to generals, as the case may be. I think Pete Pace probably would be better to answer that than I, but there is a picture in the book of me shining General Pace's shoes. So I hope someone looks at that. There's been a lot of talk about Rumsfeld coming into the Pentagon and having some theory about technology or modernization or transformation or something. It just wasn't the case. I was minding my own business in Illinois, happy, and had no idea of coming back into government. And Governor Bush gave a speech at the Citadel talking about what he thought to be the important things that were needed to be done to bring the Department of Defense into the 21st century and into the information age. That was the blueprint for what he wanted. And when he asked me to consider coming into the government again after being out for 20, 25 years, that was what was on his mind. He was interested in having the Department of Defense engage in a process of transforming itself to fit the challenges of the 21st century, which he saw as being notably different from the prior period. That was the challenge. That's what we set about to do. And once you do that, basically you begin by saying you've got to have to engage people, and things are going to have to change in one way or another. You sit down and work with these people, and change is hard. People in the military are proud. They've developed a doctrine that they were taught and believe in and been implementing in many years of their lives. And when a president comes in and wants to make adjustments to what is comfortable, what is known, what is reasonably certain, what has been practiced, that which has been exercised and they trained under, that's uncomfortable. And so the challenge, the basic entry of President George W. Bush to the presidency was in fact something that would inevitably have caused people to be uncomfortable and not totally comfortable with a new president that they didn't know, and with the kinds of changes he was urging. General Pace talked about the situation in Afghanistan and the people. I should say one other thing about the generals. I mean, Pete, you should answer this, but I mean, I'm was in meetings very comfortable having people answer questions, and I like to ask questions and I like to learn. And I must say, I do confess that if the answers were not good, I had trouble hiding it. Is that fair?
That's fair. You could, but, yeah,
Is it an understatement?
no.
No.
It is absolutely true that if you arrived at a meeting with the Secretary of Defense and you had not done your homework, you were not going to have a good day. And that's shame on the generals who didn't do their homework. I will not take much of the Secretary's microphone time, but I will tell you, those folks who are out there, revolt to the generals, etc., each and every one of those was either working on rumor because they were not in a room, or they had their butts chewed for good reason because they hadn't done their homework.
The Afghan army, Pete has described accurately. There was concern that they wouldn't be able to afford it, but he's also absolutely correct when he points out that we could, with a relatively modest amount of money, help them support it at a cost per person that is vastly less than what it cost the United States to do that. One thing that hasn't been brought up in the connection of both Iraq and Afghanistan is first of all, I did write a paper in March of 2001 that's on the website talking about guidelines for using military force, for the United States to use military force. And I sent it to the national security participants and to the president because this is well before September 11th. I thought it was important that we think about that and have some understanding. And I hope people will take a look at it, because somewhere buried in there is a comment that I think that we in the United States have to have a healthy respect for the things we can't do as well as for the things we can do. And I think we do have to have a degree of modesty about our ability to nation build. I think that countries have different cultures, they have different histories, they have different tribal arrangements, they have different neighbors, and times vary. And it is not possible for the United States, I don't think, to quote, build nations. I think people build nations, and they have to do it themselves. And we can help to create an environment that's hospitable for them to do that. But I think it is only realistic to face up to that fact that they're ultimately going to have to do it. Now, there's some middle ground, obviously, between hands off and hands on. But the reality is Americans have a tendency to, I mean, we can, if a ditch is to be dug, and there's a bunch of people standing around, our inclination's to go dig it. And we'll dig a good one. No question about it. But if the goal is to dig 5 million ditches, we ought not to be digging ditches. We ought to be teaching people how to dig ditches. We ought to have a tolerance level that the ditch isn't going to be quite as good as we might do it, or just the way we might do it. Might be not as fast as we might do it. But we have to understand that, it seems to me. The Afghanistan situation, I've had the impression that the discussion about it was in the current administration that the government took their eye off Afghanistan. And I just don't think that's the case. I mean, the reality is we went in with limited forces. The accomplishment that General Frank's plan, which was a master example of close relationships, intimate relationships between the CIA and the Department of Defense, our special forces. They went in, they did a superb job. They killed and captured a lot of Al-Qaeda. They managed to move the Taliban out of Kabul and then out of most of the rest of the country. And the level of violence during the period after that was very modest. It was low. And now, to be sure, the Taliban are determined. They want it back, and they're going to try to get it back. And they went into Pakistan, and they ran silent and deep and prepared themselves and came back over a period of time. And at some point, but during the period 03, 04, the big Iraq period, when people were all concerned about taking the eye off Afghanistan, Afghanistan was in very good shape. They drafted a constitution, they elected people, they set about their business. Refugees came back by, 800,000, a million refugees came back into that country. And you drove down the street and you'd see all kinds of economic activity. That is a misrepresentation of history as I saw it. At some point, I don't know when it was, but I think it was 05, probably Doug, I got concerned, or 05, I think, and I asked Mayor Strmicki to come in and take a look at it. And he did, and he came back and said there are some things we ought to be doing, that the Taliban are regrouping, and we began to see a level of violence increase. And we then set about, as Pete says, increasing the Afghan army and taking a series of steps. But in the last analysis, I personally believe that Afghanistan's going to evolve in a way that fits Afghanistan and fits its particular stage of development. And it's not going to be the idea that we have a template that works elsewhere. I think is a misunderstanding. I think we didn't even have this template ourselves. I mean, think of the bumpy road our country went through. My goodness, we had slaves into the 1600s. We had a ghastly civil war. Women didn't vote till the 1900s. We didn't arrive in 2011 like this. And those countries aren't going to arrive where they're going to end up. They're going to have to work their way through just like we did and like other countries do. And it's not a smooth path from authoritarian systems or different systems or drought or civil war or 10 or 12 years occupation by the Soviet Union. It's not an easy path from there to where I think they're going, and admittedly it'll be bumpy. Weapons of mass destruction, I don't know. That's been handled. I do agree with Karl Rove. He wrote a book. He said probably the biggest mistake they made was not rebutting that Bush lied, people died. It is, in my view, a disgraceful allegation. There is no question that the United States men and women in the military who put on chemical protective suits as they were moving north in Iraq, they didn't do it for the fun of it because they liked to wear them. They did it because they were concerned. And every leader in the neighboring countries said, beware when you get closer to Baghdad, as Pete says, you're going to face, unquestionably, you're going to face chemical weapons. And to not rebut it and to allow it to happen undermined the Bush administration, the president. But you can be absolutely certain that every word that the president said he believed, that every word Vice President Cheney said, every word Colin Powell said. Here's a man who had more experience with intelligence matters than anyone in the government, including George Tenet. He spent a lot of time preparing his remarks to the United Nations. He worked and worked and worked out at the agency, at his house, in the office, with Condi Rice, and he believed every word he said. And the idea that it was a lie is just plain, inexcusably irresponsible. Jamie, I listened to you and I wouldn't know where to begin.
I can help you with that.
I made a few comments about the press. One of the stories in the book I discuss is a story from my first executive position as the director of the Office of Economic Opportunity, where an article was written that was just totally inaccurate. And so I invited the person in and let him see what was going on, and he saw it was totally inaccurate. And he said he was sorry and left and never uttered another word about it to correct it. And the paper didn't. And it was kind of a wonderful experience for me because I learned early There was another myth about General Shinseki that I describe in the book that has probably been printed in the press and on television, I don't know, thousands of times, literally thousands of times. And God bless Jamie, he went out, found the facts out, and wrote a story and said that it's almost chipped in stone that this happened. And it didn't. It's totally inaccurate. The mythology about General Shinseki, what he said, what he meant, what happened, how he served out his term, and so forth. And Jamie wrote a amusing and interesting but not widely repeated article correcting the facts. Scooter brought up something that I think, and I'll kind of wind up with this. You know, if you think about it, World War I and World War II had a finite beginning and a finite ending. The Cold War didn't. The Cold War kind of came along and lasted decades. And I worried about language, the idea of calling the war on terror a war, because it bothered me that it left the impression that it could be won by bullets, and it can't. It left the impression that it was the Department of Defense's responsibility and not the rest of the government and not the private sector. And that's not the case. It is much more like the Cold War, where there was a competition of ideas between communism and its expansionist activities and people who believed in free political institutions and free economic institutions. And this, too, is a competition of ideas, this competition we have with radical Islamists. And to prevail in it over time, and think of the Cold War. It took administrations of both political parties in our country, and it took administrations in our allied countries to a persistence over a long, long period. And it was an impressive thing that was accomplished. I submit that the difficulties we face today with radical Islamists is of a kind, and that it's going to take a long time, and that it isn't going to be won with bullets. You're not going to round. I have no idea. In fact, I had another memo on the website. I can't remember the date, but the year, but I think it was October 16th for some reason, because it leaked in the press within a week, and I only sent it to 3 people, I think. But I basically said, look, here's our policy. We've got to pursue it, and it's important that we protect the American people. But I don't know that I've got any metrics that I can tell how we're doing. I don't know if we're capturing or killing terrorists as fast as they're able to recruit them and train them and finance them and organize them and send them out to kill innocent men, women, and children. And I still to this day don't know that we've got any metrics like that. There is one metric. I mean, people have done a lot of fussing about President George W. Bush and the structure he put in place, including indefinite detention and military commissions, which have been a long part of our history, and Guantanamo Bay, a prison that's been maligned, and the people who've served down there have been criticized. I would submit that it's undoubtedly one of the finest prisons on the face of the earth. It has been exceedingly well run. And I asked a journalist the other day, I said, she was interviewing me, and I said, give me a sense of how many people we probably waterboarded down at Guantanamo. And she said, oh, tens. Of course, the answer is 0. There was never anyone waterboarded at Guantanamo. Not one. But in any event, here we are. It's almost April 2011. We could have a terrorist attack tomorrow. They can attack at any time, any place, using any technique, and it's not possible to defend against terrorist attacks in every location, at every moment of the day or night, against every conceivable technique. But the short answer is that we haven't had a successful attack in the United States of America for close to 10 years. And that is, in my view, is a credit to President Bush and the structure that was put in place. And it is not simply a defensive structure. The success, I think, is rooted in the fact that the decision was made that you can't defend everywhere all the time. Therefore, you must go out and put pressure on them and make everything they do harder. And that has been done very well. It's harder for them to raise money. It's harder for them to travel. It's harder for them to talk on the telephone. It's harder for them to do everything they do. Now, I'd give us a good grade there, the president. I would give us a low grade on competing in the competition of ideas. We have not done well at that. The Bush administration was reluctant to talk about Islamists because we didn't want anyone to believe that we were against a religion or against hundreds of millions of people that are all across the globe who are not radical and are not Islamists and are not terrorists. But there's a nervousness about it, and people didn't want to be accused of being against a religion. So I'd give us a relatively high grade in terms of helping to protect the American people. I'd give us a relatively low grade in terms of communicating and competing in that competition of ideas. But unless we do it very, very well, it seems to me, we won't know how well we're doing, and we may not be doing well enough. Last, there was talk about the interagency process. I listened to the people talk about it in Jamie's business, and I suppose if I were in his business, I'd do it too. But they personalize it. They want to make it this guy is against that guy, or this person is against that person, or they're the battle of titans going on. And if you think back, well, in recent memory, I mean, Henry Kissinger had trouble with Bill Rogers in the press. You read that. He had trouble with Jim Schlesinger. You read that in the press. Brzezinski had trouble with Cy Vance. You read that in the press. And George Shultz had difficulties with Cap Weinberger in the press. And it's a pattern. It's personality. Well, it isn't personalities. People have different views, and there ought to be different views, and that's healthy. And that's for the president to then listen to those views and make a judgment. And it seems to me that I just got off the phone before I came over here with George Shultz, who's a longtime friend, and he said he'd written an op-ed on this subject that he hopes will be printed soon. But the thing I would say is that at the end of World War II, we were at an inflection point between the end of the war and the beginning of the Cold War. And an enormous number of institutions were fashioned during that critical period, to the great credit of the people who served in the Truman administration. But you ended up with the UN and the NATO and the IMF and the World Bank, and here at home we ended up with the National Security Council, the CIA, the Department of Defense, USIA. All these institutions were created that started working during the period from the end of World War II up into the beginning of this century. Well, we're at another inflection point. We're at the end of the Cold War, and we haven't done much to modify those institutions. And they don't work as well in the information age and the period going forward. And one of the recommendations I made that's on the website, if I hadn't mentioned it, it's rumsfeld.com. I don't see a lot of pencils out, but I sent a memo, I think, to the president on the subject where a group of us in the Pentagon talked about this and said, look, why don't we get, back then it was called a Hoover Commission at the end of World War II. And they got people from both political parties, public government, non-government, and they thought about these things in a serious way and then came out with a set of proposals. And we need that today. We need to think through these things as to how these institutions, departments, often influenced in a significant way by congressional committees and subcommittees that are very turf conscious. And then the State Department, the Department of Defense, the CIA, they all pop up. And as Peter Rodman once wrote, I think, they need to bend if they're going to come in towards the president so you can begin to pull those threads through a needlehead. And he can make rational decisions and not have a clash as they come up. Now, there have to be ways we can do that. I'm not smart enough to know what they are, but I do know that the information age is a terribly difficult thing for our government to manage, to handle. We're not organized that way for the information age. I mean, half the people in here don't even know what a tweet is, I'll bet. well, maybe a third or a tenth. But all of us have got to adjust and adapt, and it's a much more it's a much faster moving world today. And I think that those thoughts are something that we're going to have to come to a grip with. And I know Doug's thought about them, and others here at the table have. So I'll stop with that.
Well, thank you very much. The point that General Pace made about how many of the assumptions on which the war plans and post-war plans for Iraq were based that proved to be faulty is an important point. The particular point that he highlighted about the thought that we would have Iraqi security forces that would be available to us to help maintain order after Saddam's ouster. I recall that Scooter in particular, when we were briefed by the CIA on the Iraqi police remaining intact, and the CIA made the argument that the Iraqi police were viewed as a professional force, and that while you might change the leadership, you wouldn't have to change the people throughout the country. They were actually well regarded throughout the country, and they would remain in position. I mean, that I remember Scooter making the point that it doesn't make sense that in a police state, the police would be viewed as professional and not an instrument of repression. There was a little bit of back and forth on the subject, but that was the CIA's position, and that was apparently an important factor in CENTCOM planning, because after all, the military commands have to get their key assumptions from the official source of key assumptions, which is the intelligence community. We've had several people raise questions about the way our intelligence community is organized, and they've said, several of the questions have made the point that there was a major reorganization in the Bush administration of the intelligence community after the 9/11 Commission report, with the creation of the National Directorate for Intelligence, and several people would like to know what the panel's evaluation is of our intelligence community now versus what it was before 9/11. Are we better organized? I mean, these are dealing with some of the kinds of questions that Secretary, you raised at the end about, are we set up to handle the current era? What's your general sense of where we stand on intelligence organization? I would ask this to anybody who wants to jump in.
Well, I would just begin by saying that I think they've got a very, very tough job. I was secretary in the 70s during the Cold War, and we were looking at the Soviet Union, and we made our intelligence community made judgments that weren't accurate in a number of instances. And in that case, were able to look at it year after year after year after year, the same place, the same people, develop the skills, get the language competence, and yet we made for example, go back, and some of you may remember the misjudgment as to the percentage of GDP that the Soviet Union was spending. And this agency was convinced that it was a relatively small number, and Harry Rowan and Charles Wolfe, I think, from RAND, concluded that it was a relatively high percentage, much closer to what Adolf Hitler and Germany was spending in the period prior to the beginning of World War II. And it turned out they both were right as to what was being produced, because we could see it and look at it and count it. What was different was the size of the economy. The Soviet economy was much smaller, therefore the percentage was much higher. And of course, the importance of it was it showed a certain sense of purpose and a determination. If you're willing to deny your consumer sector to that extent, that's a big deal. And of course, in the Reagan era, when the Cold War was won, if you will, that critical question as to how could the economy of the Soviet Union survive what they were spending was not trivial. That question that was being debated, and it turned out the agency was wrong. Now, I give them a lot of credit. I think we've got a lot of wonderful intelligence people working their heads off trying to do it right, and and it's very, very hard. We're dealing with closed societies, rogue regimes, ungoverned areas. We're dealing with not just nation states, but we're dealing with networks, and it's an area that we have not in. And we had a big dip in intelligence investment during the 90s. Let there be no doubt, there was a bathtub. And it takes a long time to develop the kind of internal competence in an organization like that you can get the language skills and develop the knowledge. So I think it's very easy to criticize. I think it's important to recognize the difficulty of it, but I do think we have to expect to be surprised, and we ought not to be surprised when we're going to be surprised. And given the lethality of weapons today, vastly different from the 1970s. I mean, the difference is just enormous. Our margin for error is not what it was, let there be no doubt. Go ahead.
Mr. Secretary, I'd like to just frame the same question in a slightly different way. One of the things I really enjoyed about your book is to the extent that it challenges and sometimes really effectively refutes conventional wisdom about things in the past. And one item of conventional wisdom applying to the pre-war intelligence and the run-up to the war in Iraq is that the press failed in its job to ask the really difficult questions, and to some extent, the same criticism applies to policymakers who are criticized for not adequately questioning the intelligence at the time. I wonder what your opinion is about the press specifically, and also in the administration. Was it a matter of whether if you asked the right questions and you were more skeptical, you would have gotten a different answer, or was it essentially the case that these things were not knowable at the time until after the events of the war unfolded?
Mr. Secretary, before you answer that, sir, can I jump in on the previous question? Because I think there's a part that needs to be answered. Thank you. I'd be real hesitant to lay a lot of blame at the feet of some very, very dedicated intelligence analysts who are trying to do their best job. Now, I told you that I had recommendations based on things that turned out not to be true. But I don't fault the intelligence agency for that. First of all, if you take one example, our intelligence agencies were getting input from folks on the ground, Iraqi, and from other countries' intelligence services, and they were doing their best job to synthesize that for us. So just like those of us in the military need to learn from our lessons learned, so does the intelligence community. And if you are a receiver of intelligence, you need to listen to what you're being told. I mean, it's like listening to legal recommendations. Whether you're listening to a lawyer or you're listening to an intel officer, and I don't mean to put them both in the same pile, but if you're listening to them, you have a responsibility to apply your own judgment. And we should not excoriate our intel community for giving their best judgments. If we want their best judgments, then we have to understand that they're going to be wrong sometimes. And if we beat them up, they're going to start going further into their shell because they don't want to be wrong and they don't want to get beat up, number one. Number two, the part that wasn't answered, I think, is what about the intel structure? We have set up a director of national intelligence who sits on top of the national intel community, except he or she has zero authority to direct anybody in the intel community and has no budget authority. So if we believe, and it's open to debate, that you want to have somebody with choke con over the whole process, then give them the authority and give them the budget. If you believe that you don't want that, fine. But right now, I think what we have is an organizational chart that looks like there's somebody in charge of everybody when they're not. Thank you.
Let me, Doug, I'd like to comment on the intel structure. I used to be in the pharmaceutical business and in research and development. You don't want one single control over R&D. You want people thinking and doing different things and trying out, coming up with ideas and a competition of ideas, multiple sources of information. The idea that it would be helpful for the United States of America to have a structure where there was a single intel person over every single thing, budgets, personnel, in the United States of America, I think would be just a perfectly terrible idea. I know exactly what would happen if you did it. The military would end up recreating their own intel capabilities because they can't function unless they have an access to military intelligence. And now there's multiple types of intelligence, to be sure. There's strategic intelligence and there's economic intelligence, but the Department of Defense absolutely needs an intelligence mechanism, and so does the Department of State. And I must say, I know my relationship with George Tenet and with John Negroponte, and our department's relationship at the senior levels, even at the Franks and Abizaid level and down a layer, maybe not down way below, but it was superb. I wouldn't have thought of appointing someone to a personnel position in the Pentagon that related to intelligence without having a long discussion with George Tenet. What kind of a person do we need? What do we see the challenges for that job? He participated in all those decisions. Same thing with budgets. We'd sit down and work out every budget issue. The idea that the director of national intelligence, the Congress behaved like that there was a serious problem because of 9/11. We must fix it. And then out comes the DNI in the middle of a war. You know, it seems to me that the people who've served in that have done a very good job of not breaking the system, even though there were people there who wanted to break the system, people in the Congress who were anxious to have it change. And let's have a new, simplified approach, one person in charge. And I think that would be a very bad idea. And I think the way the DNIs we've had have handled it have been wise and prudent, and I congratulate them for it.
Well, just to be clear, my question was not about any criticism of the imperfection of the intelligence, but whether there was an appropriate degree of skepticism by the administration and by also the press at the time.
Well, go to the website and read the parade of horribles that I wrote, and sat down with people in the staff, and we talked about what are all the things that can go bad. And one of them was we may not find weapons of mass destruction. I mean, it was right there, written, sent around to the NSC members, sent to the president. And we thought about those things. I was on a program with O'Reilly not too long ago, and he kept saying, well, why didn't you tell us? Why didn't you tell us the things that might go wrong? And I said, oh, wonderful idea. Let's tell the enemy every conceivable thing we think we might have a problem with so that they can get about doing it. No, we didn't. That's not the kind of thing that you tell the press or talk about publicly, but there's a list of, I don't know, page after page of things that Doug and other people in the government thought about and we talked about, and Pete Pace and Dick Myers, and that was circulated and people were worried about.
You think the press fell down on its job?
Oh, goodness, we haven't got time for that. No, Jamie. No.
I don't mean me personally. Obviously, I did a terrific job. I mean the media in general. Well, look, I've had good.
We've naturally focused in this discussion on the period of the Bush administration for obvious reasons, but one of the things in Secretary Rumsfeld's book that's particularly interesting is the discussion of his career going back to when he was in the Navy, and then his first run before the age of 30 for Congress, and then all of his various jobs up before he became Secretary of Defense for the first time in the mid-'70s. One of the jobs that he had was U.S. Ambassador to NATO. And we've had a question which I think helps tie together your early history, your time as Secretary of Defense in the Bush administration, and current affairs with Libya and all that's going on right now. What's your evaluation of NATO, and what's become of NATO? How has it made the transformation from its original purpose as a Cold War alliance to what it became when you were Secretary of Defense in the Bush administration, and now how do you see it functioning when as President Obama is calling on it to act in Libya? What's your general evaluation of NATO? By the way, I'd be interested, Pete, if you would want to chime in, or Scooter also. I know you all have thoughts on the subject.
I think it's NATO is struggling, just like the other institutions I mentioned are struggling. They haven't quite evolved or been adapted or adjusted to fit the 21st century. Now, I think it's if you look down from outer space on Earth, there, a finite number of countries that have our values and that have free political and free economic systems, and most of them are in NATO. Now, there are many others, obviously, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Singapore, South Korea, and the like, but India. But these countries are important. And most of the problems we face are problems that we can't do by ourselves. We can't deal with the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, a single nation, or piracy, or the drug problem, or slave trade. There are any number of things that require coalitions. Now, I'm a believer that the mission determines the coalition, and the coalition ought not to determine the mission. But having these countries together in NATO, I think, is potentially very useful. And when the United States has provided strong leadership and given those countries a time to adjust and think about it and determine the extent to which they may or may not want to participate in a coalition to do something, then NATO has functioned quite well. And to the extent we've been in a hurry or we haven't provided leadership, there have been problems. I've been struck by all this talk about coalitions with respect to Libya. I mean, if you go back to the global war on terror, President Bush and Colin Powell put together a coalition of something like 90 countries. In Afghanistan, there were 69 countries. In Iraq, there were 45 countries. The Proliferation Security Initiative, I think, had 98 countries. And yet President Bush was labeled a unilateralist. The difference, it seems to me, was that they set about the task of recognizing that we needed help and we needed people, but we needed people to agree on the mission. And I think the problem we've seen most recently is the confusion over the mission. I mean, imagine if you're sitting in Libya and you're an ambassador or you're a government employee or you're in the army, you're a colonel or you're a private, or you're in the neighborhood and they're looking for cooperation. The rebels are looking for cooperation. They want intelligence, or they want assistance, or they want food, or they want housing. And you don't know, even to this day, whether Gaddafi's going to go. Imagine. Now, we're there, it seems to me, until, people are a lot like magnetic particles. They point where things are going to happen. What's going to happen? And is it likely to change or isn't it? And where are they pointing? Well, they're all over the lot because they don't know what's going to happen. They don't know if he's going to be there. If they're going to get up in the morning, he's still going to be around. It's going to alter your behavior just as sure as anything. The thing that worries me about what's going on in Africa is that the critical element is Iran and Syria and the damage they're doing us in Afghanistan, the damage they're doing in Iraq, the potential for the damage they're doing in Lebanon and supporting Hezbollah, and the risk of Iran with nuclear weapons. The other major factor is Egypt and its size, its importance, and Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries. And what we do in Libya is what we do anywhere is seen elsewhere in the world. And people make judgments over it. How we behave is going to alter their behavior. And what we do in Libya, given the visibility of it today, is going to be taken into account in the areas that are critically important. The two anchors, the Gulf and Egypt, in the case of that part of the world, and in Iran and Syria. I think that I worry that we're not taking those things into account, and I would say that they're the main feature out in that part of the world.
Can I ask General Pace, if President Obama asked you based on your experience, for thoughts as he's looking to NATO to play a substantial role in Libya. What are the thoughts you would offer him?
I will not answer that question, and I'll tell you why. To be an advisor to the President of the United States and an advisor to the Secretary of Defense, you must have absolute confidence and trust in that individual. And you cannot worry, if you're the president, when you pick your chairman, is that chairman a closet Republican? Is he a closet Democrat? Is he going to write a book? Are the things that I say to him in private going to someday be published? So for me to speak for or against something that President Obama is doing is wrong. I would give my counsel in private. I have to the Secretary of Defense. The person to answer that question is the current Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mullen. But I think officers who serve, have the privilege of serving at the senior ranks of the U.S. military, do damage to the relationship between the elected officials of our government and those who serve in the U.S. military when they step outside of their private advisory role because it is inappropriate. I didn't need my predecessors helping me advise Secretary of Defense and the President. Mike Mullen does not need me helping him, and whoever comes next won't need our help either. So I think it's ill-advised for very senior military folk to do damage to the current serving force by speaking out of turn. Having said that, I would like to take 2 seconds to talk about the NATO question that Doug asked before that one of me, and I'd like to take it from a purely military functioning. The non-NATO coalition that was put together going into Afghanistan, the non-NATO coalition that was put together going into Iraq, required the leadership and unique command and control and capabilities of the U.S. military. The long-standing NATO coalition, which is NATO, also requires the unique leadership, command and control, and military capabilities of the U.S. military. So NATO as an institution acts as it does, but the military functioning, whether it's a coalition of non-NATO or a NATO coalition, is going to be very dependent on the day-to-day leadership and capacity of the U.S. military.
And I would say not just the military leadership, but the political leadership in NATO requires U.S. Involvement and direction. It's just a reality of that institution.
So you're saying that we're turning the mission over from us to us?
Yeah. Yes. But not in an insignificant way.
Right.
Not in an insignificant way. From a pure military execution standpoint, I meant exactly what I said. The authorities, though, are very different. And the coalition of non-NATO countries is one thing, which may include NATO countries. But the coalition, which is NATO, which has stood the world in good stead for many decades, is a unique institution. So we shouldn't poo-poo that fact. As a military person on the ground executing, my day-to-day tasks are going to be very similar. I'm just talking to different people when I do it.
I think one of the things about NATO, Doug, the Partnership for Peace program has been a terrific thing where non-NATO countries have been engaged and brought in and begin to develop relationships with NATO nations' militaries. And military-to-military relationships are just critically important. They really are. And they get engaged and interested. They begin to understand our values and civilian principles of civilian control and how the military functions and become much more professional. There are other parts of the world, I mentioned some of those countries, where I would like to see us develop a relationship, for example, with Singapore, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, some of the India. Not a formal one, not coming into NATO, but a closer knitted relationship, because those are countries that as I say, if you're going to deal with a problem like the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction around the world, you're going to have lots of countries engaged. And to have some linkage with NATO of some sort, it seems to me makes sense. Clearly, the United Nations has demonstrated that it can do certain things, but major things like I'm talking about really don't fit in their satchel.
You just highlighted a topic that was a major concern of yours when you were secretary. It didn't get as much attention in our panel today. I'm glad you raised it. I mean, the focus on the United States as a Pacific power was something that you talked about a lot. And one of the major projects that that you launched and that you highlight in your book, and that we've received 2 or 3 questions about, is the realignment of the American defense posture all around the world. This was, I believe, the first time in history that anybody actually said we're going to look at the way U.S. forces are deployed, postured, ready to operate around the entire world all at once in a single exercise. How much of that, in your sense, I mean, what's your evaluation looking back on that project? I mean, is that going forward? Do you think that you actually succeeded in reshaping the defense posture? It's there. Some of the key elements of what you worked on were extremely controversial at the time, and people were waiting for your departure to try to roll them back. Where do you think it stands?
Yeah, that's the understatement of the afternoon, I think. When I arrived, I looked around the world, and what we had forces basically where they were left over from the Cold War. They were in some countries where the countries didn't want them. They were in, it was not hospitable for our troops. And by golly, you've got a volunteer force. You better have them in places that are hospitable to the extent you can do it. Second, they were in places where the countries had developed an ownership interest over them and decided that those forces were for them. Our forces were for them, period, and that we could not use them elsewhere. So in some instances, they said, look, you can't use them unless our parliament approves it. You can't move them out of our country. Another country said to us, look, if you're going to do anything with any of these forces in Afghanistan or Iraq, you better move them now before our parliament gets involved or before our government gets involved. Some of the political parties in a coalition or the coalition will get pulled down. We were spending $236 million a year, as I recall. I could be wrong, but that's close enough for government work. In Iceland, to have our airplanes be sure that Soviet bombers weren't harassing people in that part of the world. There was no Soviet Union. There had not been a Soviet Union for years and years. We didn't need to spend $236 million to have those aircraft. What were they doing? They were going out doing search and rescue for fishermen from Iceland. Now, I've got nothing against fishermen from Iceland. We still had people in the Sinai from the Middle East War that stood there and looked across the water to see what was happening. And I started moving it, and the opposition was just horrendous. It took me 4 years to get them out of Iceland. At $236 million a year. Think of it. Everyone was against it. Don't rock the boat. We don't want that. And there were, frankly, a couple of countries that said, look, you can't use these forces in Iraq because they're to protect us. Simultaneously, some of them were reducing their military while we were holding ours and increasing ours. So it needed, Andy Poland sitting back there. You were involved in it, Andy, as I recall, extensively, and it was tough, and there was a lot of resistance from the State Department because it caused ruffles with our allies and friends around the world who worried about it. Did we make progress? You bet we made progress. Was it pain-free? No. There was some pain along the way.
One of the questions is, it relates to the comments that Secretary Rumsfeld, you made earlier about dealing with the war on terrorism, not just as a matter of capture and kill operations, but also as part of a battle of ideas. And the question is, how can we think of winning a war of ideas when there are no warriors of ideas in the U.S. government? I mean, it raises the question, is there an agency of the U.S. government that has the responsibility to deal with the ideological challenges relating to terrorism? And how do you work on that?
Not only no, but to the extent anyone in the government tries to do it, they're immediately landed on with both feet. I can remember when I was a congressman in the 60s and John F. Kennedy was president, and there was a film made by USIA about the Kennedys in India as a way of promoting America and so forth overseas. And the movie was played overseas in India, and it was a darn good movie, film. And then, of course, the Congress found out what was going on, and they look at it, and here's taxpayers' monies being used to develop a film that's highly complimentary to the Kennedys, and it is played in India and other places, but it's also played in the United States. The world is the world. You can't have something to one audience and not expect it to be to every audience. And so people in Congress got very nervous about using taxpayers' money for that purpose. General Casey, as I recall, found that in Iraq, he needed cooperation of the people. He needed Iraqis to give intelligence. General Abizaid said the single most important thing we need is the Iraqis to give us intelligence. That's how we're going to deal with this problem of an insurgency. So we decided that the press in Iraq was publishing every bad thing, not any good things that we were doing, but all the bad things that happen. Some civilian gets killed, or someone's wounded, or there's a bomb that hits a civilian location that shouldn't. That's highly publicized, and all the fact that the military was out there putting generators in schools, generators in hospitals, helping people, bringing them into our hospitals, none of that was getting reported. Casey decided to hire some people to see that the stories could be written and given to the Iraqi newspapers so that they'd end up in the Iraqi press. Oh, my goodness. Oh, what a terrible thing to do. Printing the truth and paying somebody to print the truth and put it in a newspaper, it had to stop immediately. The Congress got highly excited about it, and it stopped, and it was over, and we were right back to square one. It is a very complicated thing, using taxpayers' money to do something that deals with information, even though it's honest, even though it's accurate. And we all know the reality. The reality is that the Al-Qaeda folks have media committees. It sounds amazing. Someone says, you're kidding. No, they do. They have committees on media. They manage the media. They do a very good job of it. And they're serious about it. And they're disciplined about it. And a lie goes around the world 3, 4, 5 times before the truth, as I guess Mark Twain or Samuel Clemens or whoever it was, even put his boots on the truth. It doesn't even get started. I write about it in the book. I talk about this mythology of a Koran being flushed down a toilet at Guantanamo, and you ended up with riots in 3 cities, people getting killed, dead. And weeks later, Newsweek magazine said, gee, to the extent we had a part of our story wrong, we're sorry. And of course, the people that they were saying they were sorry were dead. And it never happened. There wasn't a Koran flushed down a toilet. And that's a problem. We don't do it well. I was asked once what kind of a grade I'd give the United States of America on dealing with issues like this in the press, and I gave us a D-, including me.
To wrap up, hope you won't consider this a parochial question, but one of the people that you had dealings with over your long career was the founder of the Hudson Institute, Herman Kahn. And I'd be interested if there are any reflections on Herman Kahn that you would like to share with us as a way of closing. Before we close, before I turn it over to you to answer that, I'd just like to thank our panelists, General Pace and Jamie McIntyre and Scooter Libby. And it's great that Hudson has an opportunity to host an event like this, and I thank Ken Weinstein for his leadership here. But any words to close on?
I think I put a picture of Herman talking to Gerald Ford in the book. I'm sure I did. Yeah. He was a friend of mine from the 60s when I was in Congress. And for whatever reason, we'd end up on panels up at the American Assembly in New York, or we were involved with U.S.-Japan relations together. And he would, everywhere he would go with this sparkly mind and wonderfully volcanic intellect, would stir the pot. And he'd go to New York and say, look, the value on this side of the Hudson, of the river, is this. The value of the real estate on the other side's that. What you need is a great big Ponte Vecchio to connect them. And you're going to end up increasing the value on the side that's so low, and everyone's going to be happy. He goes to Japan with me, and he starts musing about the possibility that the Japanese will have nuclear weapons at some point, because it's a bit of an anomaly for a major country in the world not to have the ability to defend itself. And, of course, that caused quite a stir. I just thoroughly, of course, he was with Hudson when it was on the Hudson, back in the old days. I adored the man. I working with him was a delight. He was as stimulating. I think back now. I remember one of his books, if I'm not mistaken, was called the Year 2000, and it's already 2011. And when did he write that? In the 60s or 70s? What year? In 67, he wrote the Year 2000 and speculated and looked out about the world, and it was just fun to be with a person with that wonderful brain and thought. I can remember one of my daughters once said, "What should I do?" And I said, "Well, go work for someone brilliant like Herman Kahn." And she said, "Well, what would I do?" And I said, "Well, it doesn't matter. Just be around him, because he likes attract, and you're going to find people sparkling around Herman Kahn, and it'll be a wonderful thing." The last time I saw him, we were doing a panel, and it was at a hotel here in town, and I hadn't seen him for some time, and he weighed a lot. He had gotten very, very, very heavy, and I remember looking at him and saying to him in friendship that he was performing a disservice to the country, that anyone with the intellect he had and the contributions he made, to carry around that much weight wasn't right, and he couldn't do it. The heart couldn't do it, and it wasn't long thereafter that he left us. But quite a man and a good friend. And I want to thank Ken and thank you, Doug, for your hospitality. I hope that the questions you were asking in the latter portion came from the audience, because I didn't see any hands go up, but I guess they were all on paper.
Yes.
Good. Thank you, Doug.
Thank you, and thank everybody on the panel, and thank you all.
Can I just say one thing? Just one thing before we go. You know, one of the things when we were at the Pentagon, they would always tell us that the essence of Donald Rumsfeld was so complex, it really didn't lend itself to a bumper sticker. In fact, they made a bumper sticker at one point that said, "It's unbumper stickerable." But after today, I think I've come up with the bumper sticker. It should say, "Don Rumsfeld, he got us out of Iceland." Thank you.
Excuse me.